Hey, finance folk! Back in May of 2023, in episode 9 of season 1, we talked about the European Green Bond Standard. I'll put a link to that podcast into the show notes so you can go back for a refresher course. Back then, it was still in its development phase, but now the European Green Bond Standard is here. It's grown and flowered into the European Green Bond Standard regulation, which will apply from 21 December 2024. That's just around the corner. That's why I wanted to revisit this subject with Christine Mai. Christina is an expert on sustainable finance and, of course, the European Green Bond Standard regulation. She works in the European Commission's Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union, what I like to call the EU's Ministry of Finance. We'll dig a little bit on how the seeds were planted and get into some detail on how the ground has been prepared and what's grown up around GBS. We're also going to forecast future growth in this field and what benefits might be reaped from what the EU has sown. Okay, let's spring to it. Christina, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, let's just dive straight into it. What is this new standard and why has the Commission introduced it?
First of all, it's a voluntary standard. That's a very important point to make. And it's basically going to coexist with standards that are already out there, which have been created by the market itself. It will offer an additional tool for all those issuers. So there could be companies, banks, governments, regional authorities who are seeking for a new way to raise funding for their green projects.
Understood. Okay, so that's what it is, but how is it going to work?
So there are three main pillars, I would say, that define the European Green Bond Standard. One is that due to the link with the EU taxonomy and the definitions that you find in there, it is very clear to every issuer, every investor, what green actually means when someone issues a European Green Bond. The second point is transparency. Everyone who issues a European Green Bond will have to follow strict rules on disclosures, both before they issue and afterwards, when they report on how they've spent the money. And the third pillar is trust, which is a really key concept here. And that trust we will build through the concept of external reviews. So there will be independent external reviewers, companies that will assess and give an opinion on the disclosures that the issuers have to publish.
Okay, understood. It sounds like what it is going to be a product that somebody like me who's interested in a little bit of investing here and there, and especially in green stuff and in environmental awareness or environmental responsibility. So is this going to be just for big institutional investors, or is it going to be for the little guy like me who is going to get a piece of this action?
So green bonds are typically sold to institutional investors. So it could be an asset manager, it could be an insurance firm. But of course, retail investors still have a chance to get an exposure to these bonds.
How are they going to?
Basically, that would work. For example, an asset manager could invest in these bonds and could then create a fund that is sort of invested in the bond, so you'd have an indirect investment.
Oh, so
in
like
the bond.
if my bank is putting together these packages of different that they, as an institutional investor, can then buy something that's a European Green Bond Standard and put it into a product that they're marketing to me directly.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
But another important point maybe to make is who is it for on the issuer side? Mm-hmm. So as I said, it's, basically it can be any kind of public or private entity. It's available to issuers who are based in the EU, but also outside the EU, as long as they meet the requirements. Mm-hmm. And importantly, it is not only useful for those who are already green, if I can call it that. So it's not, it's useful for, let's say, a renewables company. But even if you're not completely green today, but you're looking to become more sustainable and to align more of your activities with the taxonomy, you can use the standard. And in that way, the standard will actually help the EU, all of us, to transition to a low carbon future. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier external reviewers and trust as well. One of my favorite phrases in politics is trust but verify, and probably in finance, especially when we're talking about labels, that it's important to trust, but it's also important to verify. Who are these external reviewers? What do they do? And what change does this standard bring for these companies?
Yes, so there are different types of companies that can perform these services and are already out there offering sort of second-party opinions on sustainable finance. It could, for example, they could come from the verification sector. So there is a whole sector, you probably know, TÜV and others, who are really specialized in certifying things. It could be an accounting firm. It could be someone who comes more from the credit rating space, data providers. So it's really a very varied group, and it's not, it's basically anyone who qualifies can and meets the requirements of the new system that we're putting in place can apply. And the big change that's going to happen is that for the first time, these external reviewers will be supervised at EU level. It will be ESMA, so the European Securities and Markets Authority, that has been entrusted with this task. And they are currently putting the system together with all the technical sort of rules that specify, how external reviewers need to be organized, the qualifications of their staff, how do they handle potential conflicts of interest. You've spoken about trust and verification. So all these things are being put in place now. And there's a little transition phase for the first sort of 1.5 years that the regulation applies. And all these external reviewers who want to assess and review disclosures of European green bonds will need to register with ESMA and then be supervised on an ongoing basis.
Okay, time to pull out your crystal ball and to gaze into the future, and we'll see what's going to come up for us. How do we expect the European Green Bond Standard and products that will come from that to affect the markets?
So we expect take-up of the new standard to increase over time. We know that from anecdotal evidence that there is interest and that potential issuers are looking at the standard. I think we will need to see, the market will need to familiarize itself with the new standard and all the requirements that will come with it. And yes, we expect it to increase over time. As I said before, the standard is not intended to fragment or disrupt the market, but really to basically give an additional option. So there will be space for different issuers with different levels of ambition in the market. We are aware that there are questions around how it's going to work, practical questions, legal questions, and we've started to provide guidance on that to issuers.
I was just going to come to that because you mentioned that the market it's going to take some time for the market to sort of adjust and figure out not only what the standard is, but how they can put together these products that are going to be based on that standard. So what are participants and supervisors doing to prepare for 21 December 2024 when this comes into I always forget if it's effect or into application. In any case, it's for real on the 21st of December. What are they doing, and what are the main problems that you're already noticing that the industry might be having in getting prepared for this?
Yeah, so they are of course studying the regulation, which is the Bible in this case. That's where everything comes from. But as usual, with these texts, not everything is in the regulation. So we've started to collect questions from market participants, banks, and others, but also from the supervisory community, who have an important role to play as well, because they will be in charge of basically making sure that issuers actually disclose properly and that they get the external review of those disclosures. And we recently organized a technical workshop for stakeholders where we collected even more questions, but also provided some answers. For some other questions, it really will take a little bit of time because we need to do a full, thorough legal analysis. And we are lining up a Q&A. So it's a technical term, but it's basically a kind of we get questions from supervisors. How is this supposed to work? And then we provide an answer that goes through a proper legal process. And we are also considering to do more in that sense and to basically publish more guidance on specific questions.
So basically the guidance in the Q&As or FAQs or whatever you want to call them, they're actually practical questions that are coming from the industry, you're going to look at them, you're going to analyze them, get legal opinions on them, and then put those out so that it's basically binding guidance that everybody can count on, right?
Yes, basically the idea is really to help those that want to implement and apply the new rules to provide certainty to them. And questions come, they tend to focus on a few clusters. So we have, for example, questions related to the taxonomy requirements. Also corporate issuers of European green bonds need to publish a prospectus. And there are questions around how that's going to work in practice. How do the requirements in the European Green Bond Standard regulation going to interact with those in the prospectus regulation, which are going to change because we've recently co-legislators have agreed on some changes to that. So that's a big question. Sovereign issuers as you can imagine, have very sort of specific needs, specific questions. How is this framework going to work for us? So I would say that those are the main, the main kind of clusters around which questions are coming in. Just to come back to a point that we were speaking about earlier, how do we expect the standard to affect the market? I think there will be a direct impact by those who use the standard, and there will be an indirect impact because we really believe that by becoming a kind of a best in class or a gold standard, actually the standard can lift ambitions and enhance, for example, disclosures in the market overall. So that's an important point to bear in mind. And we also hope that maybe it will even entice some players to the market for green bonds who have so far not issued any green bond. So that's really, I think there is a statistical sort of impact, but there's maybe also an impact that really is a bit more indirect, but still important because, we hope that it can really have a kind of an impact in the sense that it lifts ambitions in the market overall.
My last question, actually, you led up perfectly to my last question, because you mentioned that the European Green Bond Standard is like the gold standard, and it clearly is, and especially when it's going to get fleshed out with the questions and answers and things like that. However, and correct me if I'm wrong, or tell me if I'm wrong, I saw something called voluntary disclosure templates that the Commission is set to publish. Now, in my hard-hitting journalist eyes, that looked like it might be something that might be watering down the European Green Bond Standard. Is that a fair accusation, or am I off base here?
It's not a fair accusation, of course. No, it's exactly. The European Green Bond Standard is really the gold standard, but not everyone will be able or willing to use it. And that's how it should be, because if the gold standard was kind of for everyone, then it probably wouldn't be a gold standard, right? And we acknowledge that there are issuers out there who might want to report on their taxonomy alignment in a standardized, harmonized way, but they might not be able to do it through the European Green Bond, but they still have an important disclosure to make to investors and to the market as a whole. And it's basically another option for those issuers to choose if they want to. They will be completely voluntary. But, we think there's room in the market for different issuer types, different levels of ambition. And we still believe that, like the standard itself, these voluntary templates can help to drive standardization of disclosures, for example, and really, provide also disclosures that are easier to compare to other types of disclosures for other types of green bonds by investors.
Oh, so okay, then the cynic in me was wrong to look at it that way. I guess if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that this is a mechanism where the Commission is making sure that perfection doesn't become the enemy of the good. That the European Green Bond Standard all the way up here, gold standard, first in class, and then these voluntary disclosure templates are going to be where you can little by little get up to that standard, maybe work your way up even, that sort of thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, Christina, thank you so much for coming to the podcast and letting me know more about the soon-to-be in effect or in application of the European Green Bond Standard, the gold standard for environmentally sound bonds. So thank you very much for coming to speak to me today.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for today's episode of the EU Finance Podcast. We've been chatting about the European Green Bond Standard, which is a voluntary standard. All main types of bonds and bond issuers will be able to use it. It can also be used alongside existing market standards. Mark your calendars because this standard will become available to issuers starting 21 December 2024. So just in time for Christmas and the other winter holidays. So why does this matter? The European Green Bond Standard sets the gold standard for issuing green bonds in the EU, giving issuers a clear and reliable way to demonstrate the credentials of their green bonds. This protects, reassures, and supports investors in making informed, responsible investment decisions, while also supporting companies and public authorities in their efforts to raise funding and transition towards climate neutrality. But wait, there's more. This standard will be complemented by voluntary disclosure templates for other types of green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds, providing issuers with yet another tool to report in a standardized way of how they're sticking to the EU's green rules. Thanks for tuning in to the EU Finance Podcast. If you're looking for more information on the European Green Bond Standard or about EU finance, check out the show notes. Do please give us a good review on whatever platform you're listening or watching us on. It helps spread the word. Like and subscribe. Until next time, bye!